Hello and welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. In this installment, I'll be responding to some of the more notable comments I received on my last video, Doomerism, the Struggle to Find Meaning. I thought this would be a good opportunity to showcase some of the thoughts people had to offer and perhaps clarify some of my own positions on the doomer phenomenon. First, I just wanted to highlight a few comments that resonated with me personally. This user notes, one thing about me is that I never like saying anything good about myself. It feels like I'm lying to the person I'm talking to and to myself. I don't think I am particularly good at, anything. I don't feel like I have any good skills or any other noteworthy attribute. Whenever I receive a compliment, for some reason, it makes me feel uncomfortable, like the other person is just being fake, even if I did do something to deserve it. Another user says, I can totally relate to this. Another part of the issue for me is that I have a decent amount of potential, I work well, I care about people, and I am loyal, etc., but I have no opportunity to use this potential. I just sit at home all day because no one would employ me, and I don't have money to go places and meet people. I've tried other ways, never worked. Or I'm too depressed to even want to. If we lived in a people-centered society where I could just go out and contribute any way I can, there's so much I would do, but instead all of my potential is being wasted and no one is better for it. It seems to me society would be a lot better if we could work for each other and not for employers who have the power to decide who's worthy of a job and what kind of job, even though most of them literally have no more knowledge or skill than the people below them. Another user says, Mark Fisher talking about how he felt he would never be able to work really hit me. I've been scared of having to go into the job market since I quit my first job after 2 months. I still get those thoughts even though I know I had good reason to leave and that my failings were part of never being instructed on how to do any part of the job and being placed under 3 different managers in that short time frame. At night and while passing time absent-mindedly, I still think it's all just a part of me and that I'll never be good enough for any job. So these are clearly very common experiences, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. Here's a common point of contention I wanted to talk about. This comment says, I was going to be sarcastic and talk out of my ass, but now I just feel I disagree. Capitalism is behind the woes of the doomer. Thanks for the comment. I just want to say first off that my channel is a safe space for some of the more sardonic people on the internet, so please feel free to use sarcasm in the future. But since you haven't really offered anything to substantiate your position, and I do realize sometimes YouTube comments aren't exactly the best place to do that, I just want to note that a very common reaction to information that doesn't mesh well with one's worldview is to reflexively negate it. Instead of doing that, it makes more sense to try and actually identify the problem. Is the source of information questionable, or is there something about your worldview that is perhaps a bit off base? Obviously, I think capitalism plays an important role in mediating our lives, and so of course it plays a role in shaping the attitudes that correspond to doomerism. Here's another viewer that seems to, at least in part, object to this claim. Doomers are not caused only by late-stage capitalism. It's a mindset people get into after being overwhelmed by their difficult situations. There are poor and rich doomers. Thanks for the comment. So my issue with this is, you say that doomers are people who are simply overwhelmed by their difficult situations, but that's such a wide definition that it basically amounts to a truism. If you really want to analyze a social phenomenon like this, you have to get beyond the thought-eliminating cliches. You have to ask if there's some commonality with respect to these various situations and to what extent they are brought about by material conditions. You know, the existence of rich doomers is not something I doubt, but it is a lot easier to stave off that dread when you have more money. In other words, rich people can buy shit and try to fill the void, and the continual novelty of more stuff makes the existence of rich doomers perhaps less prevalent and less visible. I think there are far more poor or at least downwardly mobile doomers. Doomerism is very much a response to a certain lack of agency. You don't exactly see a lot of these doomer memes saying, has money but doesn't know what to do with it. Like, that's not a typical doomer problem. But hey, it is worth pointing out that capitalism alienates rich people too. It separates them from the rest of us. I mean, I guess if you have some serious cash, you're more likely to interact with people in that same economic position. But you always have to wonder whether or not people are nice to you simply because of your social status. And you have to worry about the implications of what happens if you fall on hard times and lose that wealth. It's a certain kind of prison, and capitalism played a major role in creating that prison. This comment says, "The doomer is not a nihilist, but a response to a culture which has been consumed by nihilism. In my experience, the doomer is a person trying to make sense of a world that is entirely constructed of hyper-real propaganda, which is so poorly directed that it has become, in a very real sense, no longer propaganda at all, but an advertisement for nihilism. I see it in practical terms as an emotional response to a lack of social mobility, but I suppose it could be argued that it can't be because there are also rich doomers. In a sense, we are all trying to solve our ambition in a society where all accomplishment is derided, trying to work in a society where all work is arbitrary. And while I do think this stems from a lack of social mobility, it is not a consequence of one's poverty, but the meaninglessness of one's own position in life, whatever it may be, because that position is definite, unchangeable, and entirely arbitrary. Thanks for the comment. I like a lot of what you're saying here. I essentially agree that the doomer is responding to a certain ambient nihilism that is present underneath the surface of contemporary American culture. The issue here is that the higher up you climb on the economic ladder, the more likely you are to fall. That's why you sometimes hear me refer to the downwardly mobile middle class. Rich people certainly have more to fall back on, but they too are at risk of falling back into the working class. So no one's position is really definite, and that's what incentivizes people to keep the whole machine running. But when all the mythos of capitalist propaganda is stripped away, you can see the vast majority of people are engaged in meaningless pursuits most of their waking life, under threat of material coercion. I mean, we even have dreams about work, don't we? They've colonized our dreams. That's some Freddy Krueger shit. It would take an extraordinary person to realize all this and not have at least some doomer thoughts every once in a while. That's why I made my last video, because I think I get doomers to some degree. This user claims that we are not evolutionarily programmed to handle contemporary life. I have a small theory that may be one cause of the doomer mindset. It's to do with our biology. Despite the strides society has made in the last few thousand years, evolutionarily speaking, we haven't changed much at all. We're all still hunter-gatherers at our core in a complex society that doesn't fulfill our instincts in the same way that it used to. Threats to our lives and family units aren't predators we can see and fight or run from. Only letters detailing debt and firing notices. You can't physically fight that. You can't run away from it. It's exhausting to try and cope with it, let alone any number of other bad happenings life throws at people. I could see why people's mental states decline when faced with meaningless options and artificial concepts we have to accept or die. So I tend to agree that the fight or flight response isn't useful in many contemporary situations. It can be thought of as maladaptive, a hindrance, essentially. There's a school of thought that says panic disorder is a persistent malfunctioning of our instinctual fight-or-flight response. This line of thought falls under the header of evolutionary psychology, but I think we should always be very careful about making any definitive claims with respect to human nature. Such claims are, more often than not, a reflection of one's ideology, as opposed to anything based in the real world. Proponents of capitalism often claim that it is simply human nature to act in our own quote-unquote self-interest. Conversely, anarcho-primitivists claim that human nature is really more in line with the hunter-gatherer societies of, say, the Paleolithic age. In both cases, you could see how they have very conveniently front-loaded the conclusions of their arguments within the very premises due to particular ideological predispositions. Both are engaged in circular reasoning. One of the major things that distinguishes us from other animals is that we have the ability to work together in order to change the conditions of our reproduction. And since that is apparently within our nature, it makes sense to say that human nature is not fixed, but rather contingent upon our social relations, the way we relate with one another. Another commenter says, "The doomer brings irony to the end of humanity. What existential terror has always lacked from those decimated by capitalism to those terrorized by the possibility of nuclear annihilation, to those huddling as bombs dropped, and especially today as we await the increasing destruction of the climate, much like an upcoming victim of Jason Voorhees waits for his turn to be slashed, is any sense of irony. Existential terror has been nothing but entirely sincere, nothing but entirely traumatic." Okay, but it's important to keep in mind the dangers of irony as a reflexive response to the seemingly insurmountable challenges we face today. I'd like to call to mind something the late David Foster Wallace said on the topic. Irony and cynicism were just what the US hypocrisy of the 50s and 60s called for. That's what made the early postmodernists great artists. The great thing about irony is that it splits things apart, gets above them, so we can see the flaws and hypocrisies and duplicates. The virtuous always triumph? Ward Cleaver is the prototypical 50s father? Sure. Sarcasm, parody, absurdism, and irony are great ways to strip off stuff's mask and show the unpleasant reality behind it. The problem is that once the rules of art are debunked, and once the unpleasant realities, the irony diagnoses are revealed and diagnosed, then what do we do? Irony is useful for debunking illusions, but most of the illusion debunking in the US has now been done and redone. Once everybody knows that equality of opportunity is bunk and Mike Brady's bunk and just say no is bunk, now what do we do? All we seem to want to do is keep ridiculing stuff. Postmodern irony and cynicisms become an end in itself, a measure of hip sophistication and literary savvy. Few artists dare to try and talk about ways of working towards redeeming what's wrong, because they'll look sentimental and naive to all the weary ironists. Irony's gone from liberating to enslaving. There's some great essay somewhere that has a line about irony being the song of the prisoner who's come to love his cage. In response to my last video, this commenter says, "It's not a bad assessment, but just as you said the generational aspect of it is too reductive, the same could be said about the ideological one. The majority of issues, attitudes, and even aesthetics can be seen in the late Soviet Union and post-Soviet countries. Pretty much all of our 1980s to 2000s rock music, film, and other aspects of culture are informed by this disillusionment in the system that was promising a whole lot, but not able to deliver much. While the sense of having no future, no place of belonging, no safety net, or even healthy relationships is currently tied to the failure of capitalism, it is hardly unique to it." I'll respond to this by posing a question. What do you suppose the Soviet Union in its later years has in common with the United States in 2020? For more context, watch Adam Curtis's HyperNormalisation. The full documentary is available on YouTube. I'll have a link in the video description. This commenter says, "Doesn't help that almost everyone in America is always thinking about going somewhere else. We can't be content. Call me a political enemy, but if everyone appreciated, interacted with, and improved their immediate surroundings, in my opinion, people would be happier. I think that's called community." First off, I don't think what you're saying makes you my political enemy. I agree that focusing on one's immediate surroundings and the local issues that affect them is oftentimes the way one's actions have the most impact. It would suffice to say that I don't disagree with this comment. It's really a matter of analyzing the why of it. In a broader sense, I do think capitalism has played a major role in tearing our communities apart, and the reasons for that can't be fully articulated in the scope of this video. This user is responding to the part of the video where I evoke Robin Williams and say to Doomers, "It's not your fault." Just because the end of the world isn't my fault, why would I feel any better about the state of the world? It's not your fault is not the solution for someone who cares about the world. It's the solution for someone who only cares about themselves and their own absolution. It changes nothing. Here's my response. In order to even begin thinking about solutions vis-a-vis the state of the world, one needs to be able to distinguish the types of problems we are dealing with here. And how you identify these types is an ideological matter. It's important to note that the meme I used as an example included the line, "ashamed to speak with family." Maybe you don't identify with this line, in which case, that last part of my video really wasn't for you. But the way people internalize blame for problems which are largely caused by factors beyond their own control is a hurdle that many need to overcome. And it's not for the sake of their own absolution, as you say. I'm not too big on moralizing when it comes to individuals I don't even know. Rather, this process of shuffling off the emotional baggage entailed by the personal responsibility framework is critical to identifying what types of problems we're dealing with in the first place. Self-help books often include some kind of imperative for the reader to determine what it is they actually have control over. In essence, what is inside the scope of that individual's influence and what is outside of their immediate control. There's a prayer commonly used in the 12-step program that goes, "God grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference." This is certainly a useful distinction, but it's not the whole story. My last video wasn't about proposing concrete solutions to these problems. I don't claim to have a monopoly on the answers here. Rather, my intentions with respect to the last video was to perhaps change the way we think about some of these problems. Whenever you feel consistently frustrated about something and find yourself turning inwards, what I think it makes sense to do is develop the habit of systematically questioning where this impulse is coming from. You might be surprised. Speaking of the liberal ethos of personal responsibility, this commenter makes an important point. Just a brief note to say that the disabled and chronically ill folk of the world have been dealing with the bullshit narrative of personal responsibility for a very long time. It's the unconscious idea that bad things happen to bad people. Thus, if you're ill, you've done something to deserve it. Unemployment has a massive overlap with this. Capitalism pushes the idea that you only have value if you can contribute labor. Well said. For more on this topic, I'd recommend checking out Kay and Skittles' video called Disability, What is the Social Model? Alright, that wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. I appreciate all of your comments. If you enjoy my videos and want to support me on a monthly basis, you can do so at patreon.com/Nightmare Masterclass. And I want to mention that all of the music you hear on this channel has been created by yours truly. A lot of it is available on Bandcamp, so check that out if you're so inclined. Thank you for watching, and good night.